Welcome to the Subcommittee on Supplies. We are back with Justice. I was informed by the Conservative Party that they had 33 minutes left, but they're going to pass it over to the NDP Party. And with that, we'll start with Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being back, and to all of your able and intelligent colleagues who help you answer these questions that we put forward. We talked a lot Friday about challenges in the justice system, some systemic issues, but I think I mentioned that today I would like to get into that a little bit further. After visiting Nova Scotia in 2016, a UN working group raised concerns about systemic discrimination faced by people of African descent, and that included the police practice of street checks. The report from the group states, quote, "The working group is particularly concerned about the overrepresentation of African Canadians in the criminal justice system, which may be attributed to racial bias at all levels of the system, from racial profiling to the exercise of prosecutorial discretion, the imposition of pretrial incarceration, and disparities in sentencing." Now, we've been told that I know this is on the department's radar. Minister, I believe you yourself mentioned last day that this was an issue that the department was taking seriously. But now, in the last few weeks, the Human Rights Commission report has overwhelmingly confirmed that street checks are an instance of systemic racism. They confirm something that the community already has known, but that they damage and disrupt the lives of African Nova Scotians and other racialized people. We've been saying this for a couple of years. The Johnson Commission raised this 16 years ago, and now this report is very clear. Whether it is ultimately banned or regulated, there should be an immediate stop to the practice of street checks. So I want to ask the Minister, will he agree to implement a ban this sitting?
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank my colleague for the question. Allow me to speak briefly to the Wortley report. I think the findings, I've said this publicly, are alarming and unacceptable. We all acknowledge and recognize that. The extent of the report and the lived experiences that formed part of that report are real. I certainly recognize that. At the same time, the content of the report is quite significant. We've continued quite literally every day to speak about the go forward around the findings of the Wortley report. I'm certainly much closer to a decision than I was last week when we spoke on a number of occasions about street checks, and I continue to engage individuals to best understand all of the implications, and much closer to making a decision. What the timing of that decision will be relative to a moratorium, a ban, or regulation will be in the very near future, and if at all possible, within the timelines of this sitting of the legislature.
Ms. Chender.
I appreciate that response, and that's new information. So we hadn't heard that before, that you were contemplating action before the end of this sitting. So I thank you for that response. But notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of information in it, my reading of the Wortley report was clear, which was that he recommended two possible alternatives. One would be heavy regulation of the practice. The other would be an outright ban. But in the section where he talks about heavy regulation, he says, pretty much off the top, if you choose this option, then you should strongly consider an immediate moratorium, because what the report establishes is just how pernicious the practice is. So given that you're taking time to digest, now, we have 4 sitting days, we think, left of this session, so 4 days is a reasonable time period. But beyond that, I mean, will you agree, Minister? Can I say you in this fora?
Yeah.
Okay, so will the minister agree to implement either A or B or an immediate moratorium in that period?
Minister Furey.
So I would only repeat what I've said, because I continue to gather additional information over and above the Wortley report. I have taken first steps in providing a directive to the law enforcement community. There were indications, whether they're perceived or real, that there was a quota system involved in street checks or traffic stops. As you would know, the definition that's being used varies from who you speak with. That's a challenge as we continue this discussion and land on a decision. I'm confident, but circumstances could impact the timeline, and very hopeful that I will be able to make a decision prior to the closure of this sitting of the legislature.
Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we'll eagerly await that decision. I mean, to the point, while I appreciate that there may have been an informal quota system, I think that that announcement that came out of the department following the Wortley report was met with some cynicism, because in fact, as far as we understand, there is no formal quota system, nor is there a performance kind of management tool that centers around street checks per se. And so for the department to announce that they're ceasing, that they're not allowing practices that already don't formally exist and aren't allowed, while I appreciate that there may have been the impulse to do something, as I say, I think was met with some cynicism. Can you speak to that at all, Minister?
Minister Furey.
Certainly, I can tell you from 32 years of policing experience that there is a real concern, and I spoke today with members of our law enforcement community on this very subject. There is a perception that statistics do form part of both quotas and performance evaluation, and whether it's acknowledged or not, perceived or real, if it's perceived and women and men wearing the uniform go to work with the belief, perceived or real, that there's a number attached to their performance, we end up with a situation where we have quantity and not quality. So I can tell you, from 32 years of policing, both as a frontline officer and a supervisor manager, there were expectations that although no formal policy may exist, the belief and perception and feeling of our women and men in uniform is that there was, and that their performance was judged on that. That's unacceptable. The directive that I issued now over a week ago was intended to address that immediacy, and that if they did exist, perceived or real, policy or not, formally or informally, that practice was to cease. The other element that I spoke about, I'm just missing some of my notes, bear with me. No. The other piece that I spoke about relative to the directive, there were two elements. There was the issue of training as well as my desire to engage all stakeholders, including members of the community, with the expectations that I would have a feedback document or action plan to address short, mid, and long-term strategies in response to the recommendations that Dr. Wortley advanced. To me, the most important element of this discussion is that around training and familiarity by our frontline law enforcement officers, women and men, who are engaging Nova Scotians, and in these specific circumstances, African Nova Scotians, in a manner that is alarming and unacceptable. If we don't address training and familiarity of the authorities that the law enforcement community have, but more importantly, in my view, the limitations of that authority, then we've failed all Nova Scotians and would never be able to achieve the intended outcomes of Dr. Wortley's report, regardless of which option we may choose to advance. So at the same time I'm reviewing the report, I'm also looking at opportunities where we can be immediate in responding appropriately, specifically to training. And it would have been, believe me, this avenue, this approach that I've taken is very challenging. This is not a discussion or subject to be taken lightly. As many have said to me, the findings of the Dr. Wortley report, we didn't need a report to draw that conclusion. The report has certainly brought attention to the subject matter. We have an opportunity to affect change, and I want to ensure that I'm taking, conscious of all the pressures and the expectations, I want to ensure that I'm taking the right time, doing the right analysis, not only of the information contained in Dr. Wortley's report, but I'm reading as well the report of Justice Tulloch out of Ontario, who himself has advanced recommendations and suggestions on how we can best provide oversight, whether there's a ban or a very strict regulation. So it's taking considerable time, but I want to ensure that we get this right this time.
Ms. Chender.
Thank you. So I guess a couple of responses to that, Minister. I think for one, as you said, for many people, this report didn't contain any surprises, except for, I've heard from some people, some of the words of the officers themselves were startling to community members, to say the least. But the statistics were not, because those statistics are lived. And so while I appreciate that you're taking time with the Wortley report and Judge Tulloch's report, I think there are also a lot of community resources here that have and continue to be experts in this area. We've had a lot of consultation. We've asked people to relive their own traumatic experiences frequently in order to come to a resolution on this issue. So I think it's our position, while of course processes need to be determined within the department, that consultation piece, while it may be welcomed, is actually probably
Excuse me.
might not be necessary. We've had a lot of consultation. I agree with, I'm sure working with the police force, perhaps. But you pointed, Minister, to the issue of authority. And so I guess I have a kind of A and B question. And the first part is, I guess, back to my initial question, what is the practical implication of directing the police not to do something that is already not a formal policy? Like, what happens when you do that? So even if your experience as in your career as an officer was that there were quota systems and there was performance management, I haven't seen that, or that hasn't been drawn to my attention in a formal way. So I appreciate the statement that it ought not to be accepted, but I'm curious really about what the formal implications, the practical implications of that are. Because it seems to me that if it's never existed on paper in the first place, it could continue to be ignored just as easily. And then I guess my second question, which I'd like to get into, are what are the legal underpinnings of the practice of street checks to begin with? You know, the DPAD committee has taken the position that street checks are illegal, that they're contrary to the charter, and that even if they're not contrary to the charter, they're discriminatory in practice and therefore contrary to the Human Rights Code. And I don't see anything or haven't been pointed to anything in any of the instruments that govern the way that police operate that gives them the authority to stop and record people's information when they're not under suspicion. So I know that's two different questions, but I'd appreciate comments on either of those, both of those.
Minister Furey.
So before I answer both of those questions, I want to go back to your earliest comment where you suggested that further consultation is not necessary. I'm not suggesting for a minute there's any need for further consultation. The findings are clear. African Nova Scotians are stopped disproportionately 6 times more than Caucasian male. I'll continue to repeat it. It's alarming and it's unacceptable. So we have to effect change. I'm committed to that, and I don't want anyone to leave this room thinking we're talking about further consultation. We're talking about action, but that will be informed by information that's readily available to us and information that I've sought and seeked and am continuing to reading outside of these present circumstances in Nova Scotia, because this is relevant beyond the boundaries of HRM, both within the province and across the country. Your first question was around the implications or the reasons for the directive that I issued. In the absence of a formal policy, and my belief in issuing the directive that I did, and first and foremost, was to identify the seriousness of this issue. That if there is a policy, perceived or real, it's unacceptable and it must cease. So if there is no policy and that practice continues, it's important that frontline officers hear and that we all repeat this behavior is alarming and unacceptable. I think everybody in this room will agree with that. The other element of that, for me, is we can talk about change, and I would say, in fairness, many have for many years, and there's been no change. If we don't engage through multiple mediums the frontline officers, their supervisors and managers, to re-educate, to retrain, to familiarize themselves with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with their own department code of ethics, with their organization's missions, visions, and values, and remind them on a regular basis of the critical importance of that. We're talking about respectful, professional interaction with all Nova Scotians. This is driven by an abuse of those authorities, or the limitation of those authorities specific to our African Nova Scotian community. So those are the reasons I issued the directive, and in addition to that, a need, including all stakeholders, and that means the community as well, to provide feedback. I cannot make those decisions independent of that broad input. I'm not talking about consultation, I'm actually talking about feedback. Provide me what you believe to be the best avenues and mediums to implement the recommendations, whether we ban or whether we regulate. That was the third element. I believe the opportunity is there to address short-term demands, and there are other recommendations that will require a longer period of time. That was the reason and intent behind the directive that I've issued. As for the legality of the street checks, I have to speak first to the definition, because there are different interpretations when we use the word street check, and Dr. Wortley identified that confusion in his report and in his findings, and Justice Tulloch identified the same concerns in his review of the circumstances in Ontario. And for the benefit of the people here today and at this table, street check in the community is all-encompassing. It's pedestrian, it's vehicle operator, it's passenger, and any other interaction with individuals as they go about their day-to-day activities when police engage for the purpose of gathering intelligence or information. Excuse me. When you talk about street check in the law enforcement community, it can be two actions. It can be a uniformed officer's engagement with a pedestrian or an individual on the street, which facilitates a discussion between two people, or for intelligence purposes, observation of law enforcement, where there's no engagement with the individual, but information is documented and stored in a data bank. When you talk about traffic stops or road stops, it is law enforcement engaging vehicles where they've observed an infraction or they stop for purposes of engaging the operator or occupants of that vehicle. And in Nova Scotia, in regulation, in provincial legislation, police have the authority and responsibility from a public safety perspective to stop vehicle operators for the purposes of requesting their driver's license, registration, and insurance. That's to maintain public safety, to ensure that the operator is licensed, that the vehicle is registered, and that there's appropriate insurance for purposes of liability. This is where traffic stops become challenging and confusing and appropriate in some cases and inappropriate in others. And when I talk about authority of law enforcement, it's acknowledged, but more importantly, the limitations of their authority, which is not clearly understood, even by the law enforcement community. So, street checks, in my experience, are deemed to be legal unless the authority applied by the officer is abused. And at that time, it's a breach of the Human Rights Act. There has been much discussion in the courts around the authority to stop, the search and seizure specific to a vehicle and its occupants. And those circumstances vary. And I'll use a couple of examples to elaborate here. A uniformed officer can stop a motor vehicle and engage the driver. That's the person who's in charge of the vehicle. If the passenger is the registered owner, create a hypothetical situation. The passenger has consumed an amount of alcohol, a friend is the designated driver, and in production of those papers, the officer realizes the passenger is the registered owner. The police officer has the authority then to engage that passenger. But if there's two passengers in the back seat, the officer is limited in any contact, any authority they have to engage those two passengers. The engagement should be with the driver and with the registered owner of the vehicle in that example. But that could change if there's an aroma of cannabis coming from the vehicle. That immediately gives the officer then the authority to search all occupants and the vehicle itself, including the trunk. And this is where much of the misunderstanding comes into play. A lot of those decisions are made roadside based on evidence that, or observations that an officer may make. And that's where it's critically important that they understand their authority, or more importantly, the limitations of their authority. If a law enforcement officer engages a vehicle and the operator is the registered owner, the limitations of that officer's authority, barring any other information or observations, is restricted to interaction with the driver. If any one of the passengers knows the officer or chooses to engage the officer is free to engage in discussion and be respectful and professional roadside. Those are the circumstances I talk about when I talk about the authority of the officer roadside and the limitations of their authority. And that, for me, rolls into the legality of street checks. Those circumstances have presented themselves in our public court systems in circumstances of trial, whether it be the Motor Vehicle Act or the Criminal Code, for minor offenses, minor traffic offenses, and or serious criminal code offenses. And no court, in spite of all of the evidence that is presented relative to the authority or the limitations of authority of the officer, has deemed a street check, or a traffic stop illegal. But we all know when you cross that line, when you breach that authority, then it is a violation of an individual's rights. And I explain that in response to your question because I go back to extensive reading and thought and discussion on this subject. If we don't engage frontline officers, with all the other information we know, that nobody's denying the findings, but we have to find a solution. And to me, the most key element to that is the engagement of frontline officers, that retraining, that familiarity, that understanding of both authority and limitations of authority. That's a long answer to your question, but my point is, in common law, no court has deemed a traffic stop or a pedestrian stop or a street check illegal. There have been situations where evidence is not admissible because of an officer overstepping their limits or not recognizing the limitations of their authority or searching and or seizing without authority. There have been circumstances where evidence is inadmissible. But to your question, no court has ever deemed street checks or traffic stops illegal.
Ms. Chender, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Minister. Although I think, as we've identified and as you've spoken about as well, you know, this is a systemic issue. And so, I mean, traffic stops obviously are the easiest example because a court will always defer to public safety in the operation of a motor vehicle. But again, I think the position, DPAD's position, which was very brilliantly articulated by Dr. Wright at the release of that report, and to which I could not do justice in the way that he does, is that they are in fact illegal, that when we're talking, I mean, there's sort of a Venn diagram of understandings of what this is, as you identify, between this, quote, experts, and then the real experts, the community. And I think the overlapping piece is stopping people because of the color of their skin and asking them for information and recording it in a database. And I think whether or not a court has found it to be illegal yet, I think if you look at the governing instruments such as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, such as our own Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, it ought to be clear. And I think as much was said by Dr. Wortley, that in fact it is clear that it is illegal, and that whether or not you want to say it's illegal, it's unconscionable, and that we are living in, you know, a province that is still deeply, whose systems are still deeply embedded with racist thought and behavior that has been there for hundreds of years. And so I think this is the opportunity to show leadership. So whether or not a court has found that, I think we can find that. I think we can take notice of that fact. And so I guess I'll try to finish up my time, and it's going to elapse in 1 minute, but I'm hoping that my colleague will just give me the benefit of finishing my last question. And we'll see. He and the chair can discuss it when the time turns over. Minister, you mentioned after the release of the Wortley report that street checks, when used correctly, were a valuable policing tool. That seems contrary, directly contrary, to what Dr. Wortley said in that report, which is that he saw little or no evidence that street checks had any impact on local crime rates. And so I'm wondering, Minister, if you still think that that's the case, and if not, if you could share that, given that since you've said you'll take action in the next few days, we'd love a sign that it'll be meaningful action and action that the community is looking for.
Time for the NDP has elapsed. We are now on to the Conservative Party for 1 hour. Mr. Hallman.
Mr. Chair, I have no problem giving 10 minutes to the NDP if
Perfect.
we want to switch it back, and then if they return that, should be good.
So the back to the NDP for 1 hour. Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're the model of collaboration over here today, but I appreciate my colleague giving us just a little bit of time to finish up here. I've put my question, so. I don't know. No, I'm not. I'm going to yield it back. Yeah.
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of points around this specific question. And I believe that when used properly, and I want to be careful with the terminology because I don't like the language street checks, although that's the phrase being used. This process is a valuable tool for police when used appropriately within the authority that they have, because that in itself drives community relations. If you read into the Wortley report and you read into Justice Tulloch's report, there are significant elements of community police and community relations. And the challenge we face in any interaction that the police have with citizens, you can measure stats of the numbers of convictions and the value of drugs seized and how many charges were laid in a month or a year specific to any offense. And that all comes through the enforcement that officers apply in the course of their duties. And what we can't measure, what we've never been able to measure, is the preventive element of respectful professional contact and how that influences people and influences relationships. And I say that based on my own experience in a previous career. Over the course of 32 years, the value of building relationships, and the only way you can do that is to engage people. But it has to be respectful and it has to be professional. So when I speak about it being a valuable tool when used appropriately, those are the circumstances I'm talking about. And Dr. Wortley states that there's little to no impact on crime stats as a result of street checks. It is the front-end application of police interaction with the public that we can't measure. And for me, that's a critical element of what our law enforcement community is discharged to do, and within their authority when they engage individuals, whether it's a street check as a pedestrian or a vehicle stop with a driver. I believe that when applied appropriately, it's a valuable tool for public safety.
Ms. Chender.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, I do think we measure it. I think that was one of the things that Dr. Wortley was charged with, was measuring the impact of street checks. And again, just so that we're sharing a definition, I think the key and most important factor that we're talking about in this conversation is the recording of information. And so while no one, including Dr. Wortley or the community, argues that frontline police have a job to protect public safety, the question is, what happens when people are stopped and their information is recorded? As I've said now a couple of times, there are serious charter issues. There's a sense of whether or not people believe that they are able to resist. There's the Know Your Rights campaign that one of my colleagues raised in the chamber this morning. Many people aren't aware that they aren't required to give information to law enforcement. Mr. Wortley said that that practice does not have an impact on local crime rates, which it would seem to me is the way we measure the impact of policing. And so just to clarify, if we're using the definition of street checks not as community engagement, not as police interacting with the community, but as police stopping people or observing people without enough suspicion to place them under arrest or to compel information, asking them for information without them understanding explicitly that they are not needing to give them that information, and then recording that in a database. So that's the definition I'm working off of. And just to refresh the members' memories, I mean, the challenge with that is that nobody knows where that information goes now that is recorded in a database. It can go, there are all kinds of reciprocal arrangements. It's been shown to cause people trouble in getting work. It's been caused to show up on vulnerable sector checks, crossing borders. The recording of information that is ascertained when someone has not done anything wrong, and there is no demonstrable reason to think that someone's done anything wrong, Is that a valuable policing tool, Minister?
Minister Furey.
Thank you. What you've just explained is basically what I've been saying. When police abuse their authority or don't recognize and acknowledge the limitation of their authority, that's unacceptable. That's alarming that those circumstances are happening. Banning in those circumstances, for anyone to think that an outright ban is going to resolve that issue does not understand the complexities of that issue. That behavior will continue if it goes unchecked. So I absolutely agree with you. As you relay those circumstances, that is alarming and unacceptable. They have crossed the line of the authority that they are given when they use street checks for that purpose. Nobody disagrees with what you're saying. Dr. Wortley identified that this would be a difficult decision to land on, whether you ban or whether you regulate. Justice Tulloch said in his report, it's going to be a fine balancing act. The only way that we are going to affect change is by getting to the frontline officers. They need to understand the authority that they have. They need to understand the limitations of their authority, so those very behaviors that you've outlined cease. It's simply unacceptable. So I'm not disputing anything you're saying. What I'm saying is, if officers apply that contact, call it whatever you want, if they work within their authority and they're engaging people in a respectful, professional manner, that inherently produces strong relationships. One of the underlying contributing factors to the mistrust that exists between the African Nova Scotian community and our law enforcement community are those very behaviors. I believe we have an opportunity at this time to effect change. The status quo is unacceptable, and it's going to take a concerted effort on the part of all of us to work towards a solution.
Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Minister. I guess we're going to have to, we disagree here, but I'm not able to get to the disagreement. So I will leave it at that, but I will reiterate that my understanding from the community, from legal instruments, and from the Wortley report is that street checks are not a valuable policing tool, that they are discriminatory. I don't think that the term street check includes respectful, voluntary engagement with community. I think we're talking about a different thing. So I'm gonna, so with that, I think I will thank the Minister for his answers. I will thank the PC caucus for giving me some extra time and hand it back over to the PC caucus.
Mr. Johns, for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I do have some questions in a moment in regards to the maintenance enforcement program, but I'd be somewhat remiss after listening to some of your comments in regards to police checks to not make a comment. I want to tell you a little story that I thought was really interesting. My assistant who actually, my assistant and I have been friends since grade primary. We actually attended the same school in Middle Sackville, Lucasville area, and we've been friends since grade primary, and I consider him probably one of my best friends. And I thought it was interesting because when I successfully got elected, I asked him if he would work with me as my constituency coordinator, and he did. And so we're the exact same age, the only difference being the color of our skin. Other than that, he's got a wife. I had a wife, 2 children. He has 2 children. We're both 50, and we hang out quite a bit. So what amazed me when I got this job was one of the things that Regan mentioned to me numerous times was that he had been pulled over in the past and felt that he was being that it was unjustified, and felt that he was being racially profiled, and I kind of, oh, come on, Regan, you got to be kidding me, but what I find interesting is since I've been elected, he's been pulled over twice, once by HRP and once by RCMP. I haven't been pulled over at all. And you know, by talking to Regan, and I've said Regan and I've had some really great discussions about a number of things, and you know, I said to him, there's certain things in this world I'll never understand, because in some ways, I've been because of the color of my skin, I'll never understand some of the things that Regan goes through. But when I remember the fear, the anxiety, and the anger that he was expressing to me one time after getting pulled over, and he had his wife and his 2 kids in the car, and the kids were scared, and you know, I guess I just want to make one comment, and back in about 2005, I had the opportunity to be the chair of the Halifax Regional Police Commission, and at that time, this was not a topic that we heard anything about, but since then, this is something that's certainly growing, and I think that we need to have leadership from the province, we need to have leadership from the minister. You know, just because something is not illegal doesn't mean that it's not unethical, immoral, or wrong. And I think that we need to have leadership from the top that comes out and identifies that this is wrong. And, you know, I think my colleague has talked in the House in regards to supporting a full moratorium on this, and I certainly support that as well. And I am encouraged because I'm hearing something that there may be a statement coming from the minister's office relatively soon in this, but I don't think that the status quo in regards to this is acceptable. And it gets me upset when I think back to how upset my friend was, because he felt he was being profiled and street checked, and I listen to the things Regan says to me, and I'll tell you, it's a different world, I think, sometimes between what he lives in and what I live in. So I look forward to I don't think anything other than, and I understand the complexities of it. I understand when you're talking about this narrow edge of the knife or the sword, I get what you're talking about, but at the same time, you know, I don't think anything less than a full moratorium, I don't think is fair to the constituents I represent and the people that I call friends. So,
Minister Furey.
So I'll just comment on a couple of points that my colleague has advanced. And I'm going to go back to some of the line of questioning from the NDP House Leader around whether a policy exists or not, perceived or real, because it's a segue into my response to my colleague's question. In in the consultation that Dr. Wortley did, you can't pick and choose what you want to from the report. You have to read it holistically and you have to understand it. And each element impacts the other. But I want to be specific to page 81 of the report. In his consultation with the law enforcement community, the law enforcement community told him that there is, formally or informally, an expectation of quota used in purposes of performance appraisals. So you can either accept the input of the law enforcement community who are telling Dr. Wortley, who are telling all of us that that practice, formally or informally, does exist. That was troubling to me. And I know from my own experience what those expectations are. So if you want to talk about leadership, it was important to first address that and make it clear to our law enforcement leaders, if those practices exist, they must cease. The second element to your question or your comments goes back to what Dr. Wortley himself identified. He said the decision was going to be difficult. He said the decision would be complex. That wasn't lost on me, and I can tell you from the discussions I've had and the material I've been reading, both Dr. Wortley's report, Dr. Tulloch's, Justice Tulloch's report, and others, this is a very difficult process where we want to land on the right solution. To your point, and I've already stated it, the status quo is unacceptable. So I agree with you. But I have to tell you as well, Dr. Wortley identified it in his report. To ban street checks would be a strong message to the community. But he also identified that banning street checks may not change the interaction between the law enforcement officer and the citizen. That's not lost on me. It would be unreasonable, it would be unconscionable for me to make a knee-jerk reaction on such a critical subject that, quite frankly, everybody has ignored for many years, for too many years. And I want to assure my colleague that the leadership that I apply to this and the decisions that we make will be informed, they will be thorough, they will be a result of an exhaustive analysis of the implications of any decision we make to ensure that we find a solution and we effect change. The second element to my direction that I think is critical to the solution is the training element, and how important it is that we engage frontline officers and refresh them so they understand the authority they have, and I can't repeat it enough, the limitations of their authority as they administer their duties on a day-to-day basis. I have seen the outcomes of respectful and professional interaction between the police and the community, and it reaps tremendous benefits. Can we data that? Can we analyze that? Can we determine the costs associated to that or the savings? It's next to impossible. Can we count speeding tickets, and can we count street checks? Can we identify with quantity and not quality? That's easy. But when it comes to making a decision, when it comes to demonstrating leadership on this subject, I've said it publicly, I'm committed to effecting change. But I also want to reiterate that decision will be informed, it will be made based on all of the information we have, and it will most certainly be made to ensure the status quo does not remain and that change is real for those who have this lived experience. Unfortunately, more apparent in our African Nova Scotian community, 6 times more apparent in our African Nova Scotian community than it is in the general population. That is alarming and that is unacceptable. I don't know how many times I can repeat that. Many of the points my colleague has made, I agree with. And literally, each day, as recently as this afternoon in another discussion on street checks coming into the legislature, I'm informed more with every discussion. This has not been an easy journey, knowing that this has been around for far too long. So I simply want to assure my colleague that, to the best of my ability, will demonstrate the leadership that I believe is required to effect change. And I will include and ensure that the broad community, all of the stakeholders in the justice system and in our community are engaged as we work towards a solution, as we work towards an action plan that will address each and every one of the recommendations, whether we go with an outright ban or whether we go with a highly regulated model that would be applied with the expectation and desire to effect change.
Mr. Johns.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I guess just a couple other points. I think that from my experience, there are many tools in a toolbox that that officers have which enable them to do their job, and you know, reviewing and removing or stopping one particular aspect or one particular tool is not going to totally affect how, you know, inhibit police from doing their job. I think it's recognizing that maybe one tool's not a good tool to be using and removing it from the box. You know, one thing I would really, and I'm going to move on here to MEP, but I want to leave it with one thing. I think that we all represent, or we try to represent, our communities the best that we can, regardless of party. And I think that issues, when issues like this come forward, or a report like the Worley report, I think that they supersede partisan politics. And you know, I would hope that that all parties can work together to try, with the community, to try to come up with ways to address these this particular issue and other issues that are similar. And so I guess I'll leave it with that and move on, if I can, Mr. Chair, to my comments in MEP. Minister, I'm curious. Oh,
No, he's moving on. We're good.
Minister, thank you. I'm curious to know, currently, how many people in the province are registered in the MEP program?
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to take my colleague back to his previous comments before I answer his question. It has been my intention and my objective to apply a rational, objective response to street checks. And certainly to ensure politics remain out of the discussion. I said earlier, this is not an easy discussion. This is not an easy matter to address. Probably the most challenging single topic that I've experienced in my 6 years in government. And that takes a lot of energy and a big commitment to find that solution. And it would have been easy for me to come out, quite frankly, and effect a ban, but I took the time to read Dr. Wortley's report. And he himself stated that a ban would be symbolic to the community, but it may not affect the change that's necessary when a law enforcement officer engages a citizen. But I have to say respectfully, both opposition parties, their leaders come out and said a ban was immediate and necessary. Respectfully, I disagree with them. We need time. We needed time to ensure that we land in the right space, that we find a solution that truly affects change. So I appreciate the comments of my colleague. I absolutely agree with him that politics should not form part of the discussion. And I ask that he work with me, that his party works with me and us in the Department of Justice and in government to ensure that we land in the right place. It is absolutely necessary. The behaviors and evidence that Dr. Wortley has identified are alarming and unacceptable. I will repeat that every opportunity I get. And I will also say that we are in a moment in time where we collectively can affect change. I'm committed to that. We'll get there. Specific to the numbers of families in the maintenance enforcement program, there's about 15,000 actually who are in the maintenance enforcement program.
Mr. Johns.
Yeah, can you tell me what the average of the 15,000, what the average participant that is in arrears would be? Is there a number of people that are behind in their, like, do you keep statistics that show people that are paying into or I guess payers and payees? So the payer, do you keep statistics on how many of those would be in arrears?
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we keep data on levels of compliance. In the last year, we've seen a 16% decrease in arrears, and the total dollar value outstanding arrears have gone from 60 million to just under 58 million, I think somewhere in the area of 57.8 million. And we've seen an increase of 9% in active cases that are in full compliance. So the short answer is yes, we keep the data, and we're able to track it on a regular basis.
Mr. Johns.
Okay, so I'm curious to know, now, I have a fundamental belief when it comes to maintenance enforcement program, and I do fundamentally believe that, that those payments are for children of separated couples. And I find it really frustrating sometimes when I hear from residents and people that I know whose spouse or ex-spouse, the payer, is significantly in arrears or doesn't pay, or if they're required to pay a certain amount month after month, they're short by half or short by 50 here, or, Christmas time, they're a little short there. I find it really, really frustrating that the government does not step in and start to garnish or hold licenses. So Minister, can you tell me exactly what we are able to do as a province, and what are the steps that somebody goes through before they are garnished?
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Specific to my colleague's question, first and foremost, there's an amicable approach to getting payors to abide by the court conditions imposed on them. So the maintenance enforcement program works with payors in a very productive way to ensure that payments are met. And there's a number of arrangements and agreements that lead to that, where compliance is up, enforcement action up this past year 29%. So that's what I call the soft approach to compliance. There are a number of other steps that are taken where the province has authority, the province and the federal government for that matter. So matters of driver's licenses issuance, when there are arrears, driver's licenses are revoked. That in itself is an incentive to pay. When you match that with the soft approach, there is a greater attentiveness on the part of the payor to comply. That's part of the increase in compliance that we're seeing. And as an example with the federal government, we see passports being revoked when there are arrears that exist. And that federal license suspension is up about 80%. The provincial motor vehicle license suspension is up 60% over last year. So those are contributing factors to the outcomes. But one of the other key elements to the success we're seeing with maintenance enforcement is the investment we've made in the workplace. In the 17-18 fiscal, we funded 6 additional positions for the New Waterford worksite. We recognized that there was significant pressure on the employees there. When I first came into this portfolio, the very first thing I did was ask for a briefing on maintenance enforcement, and within days traveled to New Waterford to meet with the team. It was clear and evident that they were pressured and under a lot of pressure to find solutions. That investment of 6 resources, based on their input and their identified needs, is another element that has been applied and utilized and a contributing factor in the outcomes that we're seeing relative to compliance and an increase in enforcement. We're in the process now, and I would say within days of going live, about a $1.2 million investment in a piece of technology where payors and payees excuse me, will be able to go live on their mobile device for purposes of payment and processing. That's a significant shift in how we manage this work. It's an element that will further reduce the pressures on our team at the New Waterford site and allow them more time to deal with those most serious cases where we aren't seeing a similar level of compliance. So a number of factors that are contributing, and some of the administrative authorities we have in partnership with the federal government to enhance and improve the maintenance enforcement program. I've said this since I came into the portfolio. It was an issue that I advanced in the fall of 2008 with the then leader of the official opposition, now Premier McNeil. Tell you a little bit of a story. He showed up at my house unannounced on a Friday night in the fall of 2008, and sat in my living room for a couple of hours, and he didn't ask me to run for the Liberal Party. He asked me if I had ever considered extending my time in public service. And we talked about that for about 6 months. And in the discussions I had with him, he asked me, from your experience in policing, what could we do in government that would change people's lives? And there were 3 areas that jumped out. There was absolutely a need to respond to victims and survivors of sexual assault. There was an absolute need to respond to victims and survivors of domestic violence. And there was an absolute need to address the maintenance enforcement program and the monies owed to children, to your earliest comment. And I saw this firsthand in policing, much like my colleague would see it in education. Maintenance enforcement and the availability of those entitled monies is the difference between surviving and thriving. But maintenance enforcement and the payment of those entitled monies for the benefit of children is the difference between living in poverty and living out of poverty. And little did I know, 10 years later, the Premier would ask me as the Minister of Justice to lead those initiatives. This is a priority for our government. It's a priority for the Premier. It's a priority for me. And it's a priority for our department to ensure we see these types of continued increases going forward.
Mr. Jones?
Thank you. Minister, I'm somebody who, and very few people know this, but I typically put my money where my mouth is in regards to some stuff. And, you know, I actually had a homeless woman 2 years ago stay with me. I got a call when I was on council about somebody who was sleeping in her car in Sobeys parking lot, and I went down and made room and found room and let her stay with me. That was November, and I let her stay with me till March so that she wouldn't be staying in her car. And you know, she didn't have her kids at the time. But I've learned so much. You know, the difference between being late on a child support payment or not paying a child support payment, my mortgage or my car or anything like that is due, I have to make those payments. Somebody who's relying on MEP, they can't go to their landlord and say, my partner didn't pay me again. They can't go to, I mean, to me, there is no soft approach. I think that this province is too soft on their approach sometimes in regards to this. This is about kids. I think that, you know, I can tell you numerous people that I know who have called into the MEP program. They've brought me the printed out list where you can phone in and get the list of payments that the payer has or has not made over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and I've seen those lists. And to me, anybody who is not making their court-ordered payments, and if there is a reason they can't do that, then you go back through the system. You go back to court, and there's a method to go back there. But if you are court mandated to make payments for children in this province, you should be making those payments. There is no such thing as a soft approach. If it's, you know, as far as I'm concerned, this province, I could tell you numerous times where it's not even a 3 strike and you're out policy. There's people that go time and time and time. They're habitually late. They're habitually not making payments. You know, those payments, which we've both agreed are for children, and it's the difference in some cases between somebody living in an apartment and living out of a car in a Sobeys parking lot. And you know, I recognize that last year there was money in the budget to look at trying to improve the MEP program, and I'm glad to see that your stats are saying that it is helping. Minister, I can sit and still tell you numerous people that have come to me whose spouses are not in compliance, and I would really encourage the department to look at not a soft approach, but a much harder, stronger approach when dealing with people that are in arrears when it comes to maintenance enforcement.
Minister Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's an interesting perspective to apply. Would be consistent with kind of a tough on crime approach, and we've seen how that has gone over the past 15 years. There is absolutely a need to address the outstanding arrears. Nobody's disputing that. I think where my colleague and I differ is the approach to addressing that level of arrears. And the data speaks for itself. There has been significant improvement this past year alone when we talk about maintenance enforcement and the monies that are back in the hands of families and benefiting children directly. We have seen significant improvements to the maintenance enforcement program because of the amicable approach. My colleague might conclude that that's too soft, but it is recognizing outcomes, significant outcomes that are important to the program and inherently important to recipients. Is there more work to do? Absolutely. We'll continue to work in that effort to find those outcomes and to change the circumstances. The technology, the mobile app that I spoke about in my earlier comments will further enhance that. And I'm confident we'll continue to see a decrease in outstanding arrears. As I said, arrears have gone up 16% lower this year than it was last year. That's pretty significant improvement based on the strategies that we've taken. And license suspensions, whether they're provincial or federal, averaging up about 60 to 80%. That's significant progress from where we were just a year ago. And I would be remiss if I did not speak to the commitment and the dedication of the team in maintenance enforcement in the New Waterford site who continue to improve the service delivery model that they are providing to Nova Scotians. Is it perfect, Mr. Chair? Not at all. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. Are we committed to that? Absolutely. Will we continue in this direction? That's the intention, Mr. Speaker, and I'm confident with the work of our team in maintenance enforcement and the priorities that the Premier himself places on this very subject. This is near and dear to his heart. He has given me clear directions, captured in my mandate letter. This is a priority of our government. We'll continue to apply the strategies that we are, and we will continue with the input from the team in New Waterford, their ideas and their vision on how we can improve the delivery of the maintenance enforcement program. I'm quite pleased with the outcomes, and I look forward to similar progress over the next fiscal year.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes ours. Thank you.
So that concludes the Progressive Conservatives' time. We'll now turn it over to the NDP for 1 hour. Ms. Martin, the floor is yours.
No, the NDP has concluded.
The NDP is completed also, so then we will now ask the Minister to read his resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do we have left? Because I would like to provide brief comments.
You have lots of time.
I'll be brief and won't be pressed to get my resolutions in. I do appreciate and value this opportunity and the discussions we've had. And although this is budget estimates, we might have had two questions specific to the budget where we actually had to refer to numbers. But I simply want to share with my colleagues how much I respect the approach that they have taken on some very topical, serious issues and discussions, and how valuable that is for me and our team as we continue to work towards solutions. This, I know we all have the same intention and the same objective. We may differ sometimes on how we get there, but I believe there is a collective will to find solutions that are in the best interest of Nova Scotians. So I simply want to extend to my colleagues, both in the NDP party, and ask that my comments be communicated to your peers and to my colleagues in the Conservative Party, how much I appreciate this engagement. These discussions don't have to be limited to this environment. We can engage one another at any time on matters that are topical to you as members for your constituency or as members of opposition in government. And I certainly welcome those opportunities. Mr. Chair, resolved that a sum not exceeding $361,438,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Department of Justice pursuant to the estimate. E23, I'm sorry, that was E13, Mr. Chair. E23, resolved that a sum not exceeding $2,615,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Human Rights Commission pursuant to the estimate. E27, resolved that a sum not exceeding $357,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Nova Scotia Police Complaints Commissioner pursuant to the estimate. E32, resolved that a sum not exceeding $715,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Office of the Information and Privacy Review Officer pursuant to the estimate. E34, resolved that a sum not exceeding $24,593,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Public Prosecution Service pursuant to the estimate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister Furey. Shall the motion stand? Motion stands. We'll now adjourn shortly and turn over the meeting to Internal Services, I believe, next.